Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming. Thank you for sticking around for the last panel. Last one. Last day, last panel. But, you know, if you believe in Scripture, they say the last shall be first. So we won't be too worried about it. And, you know, hope you all make that bus. But I'm really interested in one of those bento boxes I heard about on the 4th floor. So you better get there before I do. Okay. And I'm really glad to see a lot of young faces here. I hope there are some students here or some journalists who are just starting out. Because you may not know this, but you've got over 100 years of experience accumulated covering Asia just between me and Jonathan here. You got about 100 years of journalism experience covering the region, and I'll add in another couple of decades for everybody else up here on the stage. But it's so it's a really great opportunity for you, especially if you're starting out or if you're a student, want to go into covering this region, to get some tips, some advice from people who've been doing this for a really long time. So I just want to, we've got varied experiences here from the region, from China, from North Korea, from Japan, Southeast Asia, and so it's a really good chance. So I just want to start out just by talking a little bit about very quickly about how I came first to Asia and some of the things that I saw on 2 trips here. I was the Southeast Asia Bureau Chief twice, once at the end of the 1980s, 1986 to 1990, and then I returned in 1995 and was here for another 5 years. The first time I came here, the late 80s, it was because of the people power revolution in the Philippines. Okay, if you remember that, got some Filipinos here. EDSA revolution in the Philippines. And people forget it, but right around that same time, about a year or so later, is when they lifted martial law in Taiwan. And then about a year later, end of 1987, early 1988, the students came out on the streets in South Korea. The Olympics were coming along. There was so much tear gas you couldn't breathe in South Korea. And they decided to allow democratic elections in Korea. And this was around the time, around 1989, 1990, the Berlin Wall came down. And so I'm thinking to myself, wow, democracy is sweeping Asia, Taiwan, South Korea, Philippines. This is a real democratic moment. I came back in 1995. I saw things hadn't changed a whole lot, except then you had the Asian economic crisis in 1997. People think the Hong Kong handover was the big story of 97. It was actually the Asian economic crisis. That started a collapse of the currencies around Southeast Asia, and we got the reform movement, the pro-democracy movement that swept a lot of countries. Thailand, you had the People's Constitution was passed. You had the the people power movement in the streets. In Indonesia, the rupiah collapsed, and you had the fall of Suharto, who had been in power for 30 years. Malaysia, you had the Reformasi movement. I remember Anwar standing up there shouting Reformasi in the streets. So democracy seemed to be kind of sweeping around the region, or so I thought. I remember one of my old headlines said, you know, the militaries are in retreat across Southeast Asia. Military in retreat in Thailand, in Indonesia, in Taiwan, where they had martial law for years. So now I look back at that and say, wow, was I ever wrong? So I'm going to open it up to the panelists here with just a broad question. I'll start with you, Sui. What happened to the democratic progression of Asia, and where are we now?
I was telling Keith and Jonathan before this that before I took on this job, I read all their stories, of course, and I feel super left out because they were covering what I thought was the golden age of journalism here. Obviously, I think a lot of people here know that democracy has only gone from bad to worse. There are lots and lots of factors for this. One of the primary reasons, I think, is a lot of the societies here have not had the kind of intellectual and political revolution that a lot of other societies have had. A lot of the citizens here don't fully understand what democracy is. And I think a lot of that is also on us as journalists to explain to them that democracy is not just going to the ballot box. It's not just voting. It's about fully understanding what it means to participate in a democratic system. So what we have in Southeast Asia, as a lot of you know, is that power is just transferred from a group of elites to another group of elites. This is why we have right now in Southeast Asia many countries that are, we have leaders where the current leader or the deputy leader or the previous leader was the son or daughter of a previous leader. And I mean, in a region of more than 600-something million people, like, are you telling me that power can only rest in the hands of these dozens of families? And I feel like a lot of us don't ask these hard questions about why this is so. Yeah, I mean, that is, and overall, I feel just people are cynical about how democracy works in Southeast Asia because they see that this is happening, then they see nothing's changing. But perhaps, Jonathan, you might have a different story.
Yeah, Jonathan, burrow in on Indonesia a little bit because you were there, and were we all too overexcited about the democratic transition?
Thanks very much, Keith. I mean, just quickly picking up on this point. I mean, I think many people do understand democracy. I mean, after all, we're not in a position at the moment where, frankly, there are any really great democratic examples anywhere in the world. We live in a cynical age. We live in an age of fear and suspicion, of conspiracies, where faith has collapsed in lots of institutions, in particular the mainstream media. I can't tell you, as somebody who works for the BBC, how much we painfully try to steer a middle path to the point where our reporting can be almost non-committal, and yet how much flack you get from both sides. And it's very hard to steer a path that way. It's a very different age today than the age which Keith was talking about, when he came. I was first deployed to Southeast Asia in the very beginning of 1996. Indonesia was my first posting. It was a country I loved and knew very well. And at the time, it was a very quiet posting. Not much happened. The people who preceded me were excellent reporters on this sort of standard 2-year rotation the BBC used to have. You take a sabbatical from your job back in London and go and work on your own as a reporter, very little backup or infrastructure, just to get to know a country well and file whatever reports you could. And my predecessors struggled because Indonesia was tightly controlled. It was very authoritarian. You didn't often know when things happened in far-flung parts of the country. Suharto ran a very, very tight ship. And it was pretty hard to become a media star. It just didn't register on most people's news agendas. I was very lucky when I arrived in 1996. Although it was quiet, things were moving. There was already a big change in the air. It was very clear that the fall of the Berlin Wall, the end of the Cold War, had left the US values, both promoting democracy and market economics, as very, very powerful incentives. And most of these countries, particularly in Southeast Asia, had embraced globalization and were benefiting from it. And it made governments far more susceptible to pressure from Western governments. So when the Suharto regime began to crumble, thanks to the economic crisis that started in '97, and the fact that Suharto was quite old anyway, and people kind of knew the end was going to come at some point, I think in a different era, his regime would have survived. Had it happened in the 1970s, it would have cracked down. There wouldn't have been a lot of foreign media coverage. There wouldn't have been a lot of international interest. And they'd have just suppressed it. Things had really changed. The 1990s were the high point of globalization and of belief that Western values were triumphant, that everyone had to kind of follow the Western model to prosper. And also the belief that international intervention worked. This is the time of the great interventions in Bosnia, in Kosovo, in East Timor, which of course happened in Indonesia. And I think as journalists, it was an extraordinary time. You suddenly found amazingly dramatic things happening around you, but also that governments lacked the confidence to stop you from reporting. We got away with a lot in Indonesia. And then when East Timor happened, that was a country that had been occupied by Indonesia since the mid-1970s, very brutally, and access was tightly restricted. You could almost never go to East Timor. No one was allowed in. The Indonesians kept a tight grip on it. But after the fall of Suharto, they started loosening up. They agreed to a UN referendum. We both covered that. We had a few dramatic moments, quite life-threatening ones at times. But when the Indonesian military resisted and tried to kind of stop once the people of East Timor voted for independence, the media, foreign media reporting, was a big story. We put a lot of resources into it, really caught the attention of the world. I can't imagine that happening today. That it was a tiny country. This is a very, very small country in a very far-flung part of the world. And yet, it was in our headlines, it was the top of our news bulletins for days and days and days. The BBC invested huge resources in covering East Timor for months. And Keith and I were both talking about an APEC meeting that took place at the height of the crisis, where all the media reporting basically pressured the Americans. The Americans decided to intervene, and Bill Clinton more or less told the Indonesians, you've got to back off. You've got to let an international force in. And I remember at the time, it happened, and we all covered it, and this Australian-led force came in, and East Timor began its somewhat difficult path towards independence. Thinking at the time as journalists, wow, what a role we played. Mm-hmm. Now, a point I've made in our discussions is, it was very easy to get caught up in that. And to believe that we were important as journalists, far more important than we probably were, but also to believe that we were doing good. And it doesn't sound like something journalists should do, but fundamentally, a lot of people get into journalism because they do hope that what they do will make things better. And there was a belief then that that could happen. I have since covered many other upheavals, I think particularly of the uprisings against Gaddafi in Libya, which I covered extensively, where reality comes home that you might have these amazing uprisings, and we might kind of be seen to be cheering them on in the media. We cover them so intensely, and perhaps what we don't do is adequately cover the downsides, the alternative side. Is this really going to be good? Are we looking broadly enough at alternative views of these things? We operate in a very different milieu now. It's a difficult one, incredibly difficult one for journalists. But I do think in some ways, for all of the cynicism and the rather unpleasant attacks on the mainstream media, we've been kicked off our pedestal. We've had to be a lot more realistic about what we really do and to think really hard about how we report things. Should we be cheering these struggles on, or should we be perhaps a little more cynically looking at the other side about what could go wrong? And I personally feel that's probably the right role for a journalist.
Thank you. Now, Shreyas, as I mentioned, I was there in 1987, 88 on the streets of Gwangju in South Korea watching this amazing uprising that kicked out the generals in South Korea, transformed it into a democracy. It came back again. I saw that again a few months ago when the president declared martial law and the people came back out again. It was a pretty amazing scene, and he had to backtrack. So do we say now that South Korea has shown us how to do people power 2.0? Or?
Well, I think, as you said, it was 87, 88 when South Korea really transitioned to democracy. So nowadays we look at South Korea as, by Asian standards, a beacon of democracy in this part of the world. And in many ways, we have seen the positives of that repeatedly. But at the same time, we also need to bear in mind that it's still still a nascent democracy in many ways. It has only been a democracy for, well, about the same time many of the people in this room have been alive. So it's easy to forget that many of its roots, many of the systems that are still firmly entrenched were built by dictators from the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s. And as a result, it's still got a long way to go, but at the same time, the events of the last 6-7 months show that, and pretty much the last decade show that there is a lot going for South Korea. We've now had 2 impeached presidents in the past decade. Now, that tells you a few things. One, there are still clearly areas where those in charge can abuse their power. When you've got that much authority vested in one person, that certainly can happen, and people tell you that irrespective of who's in charge, there will always be a tendency to just perhaps make things by executive decision more than really a consensus. And in some cases, that leads to disastrous consequences. When it comes to the martial law, for example, a night that involved a lot of swearing for many journalists in South Korea 6 months ago, I think perhaps it showed both the good and bad sides. It was very easy for Yoon Yeol to declare martial law. And frankly, we should probably count ourselves still a little lucky that it was so incompetently executed. I mean, even the military wasn't fully marshaled as much as one would expect to stop the only legislative action that could undermine them. The media continued reporting despite the martial law decree saying we're going to clamp down on media action. And so it did go ahead. But at the same time, we now saw that there are mechanisms in place to stop uh, people from declaring martial law that freely and taking control as they did in decades past. Parliament shut it down very quickly. And in the days that followed, the people made their voice heard. And they made it clear that they will not accept a return to the martial law, the period of that was last seen in the early 80s. And over the last few months, we've seen repeatedly those mechanisms, even if they're still democracy in South Korea is in some ways fragile, but it has come a long way since the 80s, and we are at least seeing some hope for it. And now we're speaking about this topic 3 days before next South Korean election. We're going to see a change of power, and it does show you that even if there are problems, there is a way to move on.
Yeah, thanks for that. We'll get back to that. And I'm glad you mentioned the important role of the media in there, because that was going to be my next question for all of you. The next broad topic is press freedom. Before coming here, I looked at the Reporters Without Borders Press Freedom Index for 2024, the most recent available. And I didn't see an Asian country in the top 10. I didn't see an Asian country in the top 20. I got the number 24, and I found Taiwan, which I must say is not a country. I'm going to Hong Kong next week. East Timor comes in at 39. I must say the U.S. dropped down. They're only at number 57 these days. But I had to get way down into the 61 is South Korea, 66 is Japan, and you have to go way down to 85 to get to Thailand, 88 to get to Malaysia. So, we talk about press freedom because it's one of the most important components of having a democratic system. So, first, one question for you, Sui, because you worked in China, Southeast Asia, a lot of time in both. Which is the toughest one to cover as a journalist, China or Southeast Asia?
I think in China it was different because I worked for the New York Times, and there was a lot of antagonism with the government and us. We were part of the Western press, and therefore we were, they feel that they were out, we were out to smear China. There was a lot of, had to be summoned to the government, for all these long, tortured conversations about what it means to cover China. And Keith, I think you know this very well too. In the Chinese government's eyes, the press is there to serve as propaganda. And so, I remember talking to the foreign ministry about this. They would come in with a stack of articles, and say like, all these articles are like bad. They portray China in a bad light. And I think they had this analogy where they said that, why aren't you covering all the high-speed rails that we have in China? It's like we invite you to a wedding and you're just covering the trash in the room. And then, I had to have a conversation about what it means to be part of an independent press with no agenda. And I told them I had no agenda because I said, look at the stories that I've covered in the past year. Count the number of stories that are actually negative on China, which is, in their view, human rights. And I said, if you count, it would be like 80-something% of the stories are just generic news stuff, business. I do a lot of like slice of life stories in China. And then, so anyway, back to that was China, and also just being in an overall very repressive environment where you would travel to Xinjiang and Tibetan parts of China and be met by state security on arrival at the airport and being just tailed everywhere and not being able to speak to anyone. So, in that respect, I think Southeast Asia, because all these governments operate in a kind of competitive authoritarian system, there is some, officials, for better or for worse, they might not want to engage with the media, but they understand that you are there to press them on certain topics. I've been able to meet with officials in most of these countries, which is far more than I can say in my time in China. And I think generally, like, people here are interested and curious in what we do, and are willing to engage.
Let me follow up with a question to you, Jonathan, because we talked about Indonesia, some of these countries around here. One of the reasons that press freedom ranks so low in some of these countries is because of the restrictions they place on foreign journalists getting visas. and also defamation laws and other type laws. Talk a little bit, you've been subjected to all of these restrictions, visa restrictions, travel restrictions once you get into a country, and the defamation laws you have to tiptoe around.
I mean, the defamation laws are very important because, traditionally we always think of media freedom, the threats to media freedom. Look at Vietnam. They lock up journalists. It's very, very clear there what the threat. There's total control of local media there. There is no media freedom at all in Vietnam. At least it's pretty clear. But if you're operating in other parts of Southeast Asia, a whole range of other restrictions come in. And I have to say, if they use Indonesia as an example, for me, Indonesia now is more difficult to work in than it was when Suharto's authoritarian system was in place. Even though Indonesia is now democratic, has a democratic system, the biggest problem is they've imposed. A lot of countries in this region have what we call journalist visas, and journalist visas are a major problem because they take time to get. But journalists generally need to travel when something happens. The news is happening. You can't sit there for 3 weeks waiting for your journalist visa to be processed while the news happens. You've got to get there quickly. It's a very weird system. Thailand has a J visa system, which if there was anybody from the MFA here would insist it's genuine. You have to get a J visa, and yet they kind of tolerate the fact that almost every journalist who comes here comes in just on a visa on arrival or entry stamp on arrival and just comes in. And the Thais kind of tolerate that. Malaysia has no journalist visa. Philippines has no journalist visa. Indonesia has a journalist visa and has always had one. But even under Suharto, you could get away with just coming in on a tourist visa. If you might have to be a little bit secretive in places, you might have to be a bit careful. The worst that might happen to you, the worst, was if they caught you, they might deport you. Today, if Indonesia catches a journalist who hasn't got a journalist visa, they will prosecute them and put them in prison. They've done it. And journalists have spent months in prison on this. It's really harsh. So we can't go to Indonesia now. I mean, this is a country I love. I literally cannot cover it. I've got visas for things like the election last year because that's a scheduled event, and I was able to spend the 4 months necessary, and they were willing to have journalists to cover that. For so many other things, it's basically impossible. So the visa situation is challenging. I'm blacklisted from Vietnam at the moment. They won't have me in. Myanmar, interestingly, very hard to get visas now, but they do issue them occasionally. Cambodia is getting more and more difficult. This region's getting tough. The other thing is laws. And the law now is a bigger threat to journalism, the way the law is used, than most other actions taken by governments. Because particularly in Thailand, if you look at Thai media, you'll see there's almost no real investigative journalism done by any Thai media. Because the moment you research a story and you come up with something that's negative, but really well sourced, it might be a really important thing to say about anybody, that person or company will file a criminal defamation case against you. And they've got a reasonably high chance of winning because Thailand's courts are easily swayed by power. It happens. But also, even if you win the case, you could be trapped for years. You're a criminal defendant, your visa gets cancelled, you're on a court visa, you have to post bail, and your company will end up paying huge amounts in legal fees to defend you.
You sound like you have some personal knowledge of this.
Well, yeah, it happened to me, which is partly why I'm speaking. So I got, just as a very quick story, I did get sued over a really fairly marginal story I did about 9 years ago involving two British people who got scammed, basically. They had all their properties and investments taken from them. It ruined them personally and was a pretty awful experience for them. But I did a story about it and just happened to identify a lawyer who had been notarizing forged signatures that allowed the entire scam to take place. Now, he filed a criminal defamation case against me, and he admitted doing it. He admitted what I said was completely true. But he was still able to get a criminal defamation case, and that resulted in me being on trial for 18 months and going through all the things I just described to you. And it cost the BBC, well, let's put it this way, well into 6 figures to pay for the legal defense. So today, if I want to do a story about a Thai business, and I've thought about a few, the bar is quite high. The BBC is going to say, good story, and yep, your sources are absolutely right. You've got clear information, absolutely clear what you're saying is accurate, but how important is this story to us? BBC is lucky. The BBC has a big legal fund, and they will defend me. Most media are much more weakly resourced. There are freelancers out there. How can they possibly afford that? So the way the criminal defamation law is used here, it exists in Malaysia, it exists in the Philippines as well, and other countries, but particularly here in Thailand, is a huge, it basically suppresses any real investigative journalism. Everyone focuses in Thailand on the lèse-majesty law, which is a major problem and has resulted in lots of young people going to prison for a long time. It's a very repressive law and a clear infringement of freedom of expression. But the criminal defamation law is used much more widely. It's much more insidious, and it really crushes media freedom.
Thanks for that. And Shreyas, let me just kick it off by asking you, reminding the audience here that, when the national security law came into Hong Kong, a lot of media organizations, parts of the New York Times decided, okay, we better get out of here. Let's go somewhere where it's a bastion of press freedom. Let's go to South Korea. The Washington Post set up a regional hub. They looked around, so we can't be in Hong Kong. They've set it in South Korea. So why is South Korea only 61 on the Press Freedom Index if it's this bastion of freedom in the region?
Well, I guess it's all relative, right? As you pointed out, there are only 2 Asian territories in the top 50. So South Korea is, relatively speaking, doing all right. But yeah, emphasis on relatively. Frankly, there are always problems. And I think, just going back to what I said earlier, South Korea is still a democracy in progress. It is a democracy, but some aspects of it very much stem from the way things have been done for decades. The current constitution was drafted by the last dictatorship. They haven't changed it since then, so a lot of the practices are still that way. And the way the media environment there is set up, there is a certain kind of transparency, where it's a very conditional, limited transparency, where the government, yes, it does release information, it does share information with the media, but usually it's through very carefully controlled pools and through certain processes that they're familiar with and domestic media are familiar with. And so what happens is the South Korean government or military or other authorities will just put out their statement on limited situations, which they'll share with the media outlets they deal with. And those statements will be printed unquestioningly. Now, there are exceptions. Obviously, there are in any country, in any democratic country, there will be some people who will push back, but it's not really built into the system, that approach that you are going to question things, you are going to actually essentially burn the axes that you have with the government by trying to challenge them. Now, there are obviously exceptions. Certainly, martial law incensed enough journalists that quite a few of them did try to push back, but for the most part, it doesn't work. And then on top of that, when you try and build in these artificial barriers to access, you come up with other methods that limit access in many ways. So, for example, foreign media are relegated to a lower lower system, essentially, where you're dealing with a separate set of officials to deal with the press, who often have less information than their domestic media counterparts. There's a lot of gatekeeping of access for who gets access to official information, who gets to be in the room to ask the questions. And frankly, foreign media have an annoying habit of asking questions. So it doesn't really endear us to the authorities. But a big part of it, more than anything else, rather than malice, it comes from just not really being used to the idea of foreign media as such. South Korea has been relatively insular for many, many decades, and foreign media also did not really have a base there. So now it's starting to grow, but the systems haven't yet evolved. So that access, sorry, just drift a little bit, but essentially as a result of this system, the way things operate, there tends to be a lot of self-censorship, particularly in the domestic media in South Korea. They do not want to burn those bridges. And then at the other end, South Korea is a very politically polarized society. We were discussing earlier, for example, as opposed to Japan, which has a similar self-censorship system where they don't want to anger the government, end their access. In South Korea, our news outlets often take political stances depending on their alignment. And so that's where you can see them more willing to push back. But the people also are firmly divided into different camps, and we're seeing that a lot in the run-up to this election. Everyone's already decided what they consider to be the truth. And so in recent years, particularly over the past decade, misinformation and disinformation have grown massively in South Korea, and that's also made it much harder to really say, this is a truly free country as far as press freedom, as far as information access is concerned, because people have already, and the media have already kind of divided themselves into distinct camps.
Okay, hold the microphone, because I want to keep you on. I'm going to reverse the order here. Sui, you'll get to listen for a while before you have to answer this question. I'm going to ask everybody here about covering closed societies, closed countries, or countries that you have to cover, but you can't get a visa to get inside. You get the most difficult closed country of all. You get DPRK, you get North Korea. Tell me, how on earth do you cover it, and have you ever been inside?
Well, this is a question I've actually gotten a lot from people at this conference over the last few days. So some of you have already heard this. Please bear with me. Well, I haven't yet had the chance to go inside. By the time I actually got interested in visiting North Korea was when I was working at the BBC in my previous job. And the BBC, for various reasons, has been, I guess, persona non grata in the DPRK since 2016. Yes, I was trying not to mention the name, but yes. There was a BBC correspondent who got detained and interrogated at Pyongyang airport for 4 hours in 2016. So, yeah, wasn't able to go then, and then the pandemic happened. No journalist has been able to re-enter North Korea since, at least not in the same way. And so I don't know, if the chance comes at some point, maybe I'll get to go. Will I get to come out of it? I don't know. It might just be a one-way trip. But fundamentally, when it comes to covering North Korea, it was always unreliable to just go with people who are in the country, who are able to because people rarely get to enter North Korea for news coverage, and even when they do, it's usually for a very carefully controlled itinerary. So you're not really going to be able to go everywhere freely, report, talk to everyone. So pretty much throughout North Korea's history, when it comes to covering it, people have had to turn to every possible source of information. You try to glean information from anything, whether it's reading between the lines of state media, which, yes, it's propaganda, but there's always a pattern to it, or looking at what foreign intelligence, the US, South Korea, etc., say, and more objective sources, perhaps, like which now exist, like satellite imagery, marine shipping data, or trade data, which again comes with gaps. But the idea is always you find patterns, you see how North Korea operates, you look at what it has done in the past, what it has said in the past. Whenever it does something now, you say, okay, how is this similar? How is this different from what they've done? And from that, you try and figure out what they're likely to do, what the implications are, what the impact will be. Is it something that really matters? And that's what you're always essentially trying to look at.
I was lucky to be able to get 2 trips into North Korea, most recently in 2011. But I was invited in on an official visa to cover things, and you really can't talk to anybody on the street. You can't walk around, freely, etc. Jonathan, have you ever snuck into a country that you can't get into? Have you ever gone on a tourist visa? And
one that's strictly speaking, I'm not supposed to go into. Actually, funnily enough, I don't think I have. I'm just going through the countries I've been to. I mean, I've snuck into Myanmar through China once, which was an interesting trip. That was to get to Kachin State. But I'm absolutely sure the Chinese knew we were coming. And at the time, the Chinese probably thought we don't mind journalists going to cover that. And we was literally driven through a sugarcane field in a battered car and suddenly found ourselves in Myanmar and picked up by the Kachin Independence Army. I think Myanmar is the one country which we have to cover and where we don't get this kind of access. I mean, I've gone to Indonesia without the visa, but what we do these days is we only go for really big stories, like that massive earthquake, and we call them up, the Indonesian foreign minister, we say, we're coming, we have to come, this is a huge story, please don't arrest us. And they give us usually about 4 or 5 days where they tell us to leave. I think in Myanmar, it's interesting how all the media are trying to handle Myanmar now, because access is very hard. I'm known by the Myanmar government. I've had official visas. I've actually never, ever been to Myanmar as a tourist. I've only ever been on journalist visas. When I have tried in the past to sneak in, they knew exactly who I was. I couldn't get a tourist visa. I actually masqueraded as a landscape gardener and certified tree surgeon from New Zealand once. I've got a New Zealand passport. And concocted an entire identity, even to the point of calling up a company in Auckland and say, look, if the Burmese call you, can you please basically negotiate for them to agree that I work there? And I sent an agent in with my passport and this business card saying landscape gardener and certified tree surgeon. And the Burmese embassy took one look at it, threw it back and said, tell him to apply with his British passport. So they knew exactly who I was. But the way we handle it now in the BBC is it's quite delicate. If you want to cover the war in Myanmar, the only way to do it properly is to go in with one of the insurgent groups. That means crossing a border illegally from Thailand or from India and spending time with insurgents. It's dangerous. It's very chaotic there. The BBC is pretty careful about not wanting its journalists to get killed, so there's a lot of preparation. But the other thing they've decided is that those of us based here in Thailand will not do that. That's simply to avoid formally breaking the law by crossing the border illegally and therefore risking our Thai accreditation. So we have BBC journalists who come into Thailand temporarily and plan those trips and go in. It's just a way of doing it. I will say one little observation about this getting into countries and sneaking, which is, look, there's no substitute for being somewhere. And sometimes it's certainly the most vivid way of telling a story. But as you said, Keith, sometimes you go somewhere, you're so restricted, you almost wonder what you're doing there. The Myanmar civil war after the coup has forced us to do journalism by remote. The BBC is very lucky that we have a large Burmese language service, so I've got Burmese journalists who were working in Myanmar, but most of them now work with me in Bangkok because it's quite dangerous being a journalist there. And they are on the phone and on social media all day talking to people in Myanmar. And with their help, we have been able to build up stories that have been really quite powerful without ever going there, just getting testimony on the ground. I know the New York Times does the same thing. And it's brought home to me one important element, which is that in days gone by, when you were doing news for your audience, particularly if you're doing it for an audience in your own country, people wanted to see someone from their own country, and it was those days, sad to say, nearly always a white man, older white man, telling the story, being there and saying, hey, I'm here, I'm telling you the story. I think it's a good thing that technology and these restrictions that we face in Myanmar has forced us to tell stories in different ways. And I put my name on the article, but my Burmese colleagues, actually we don't put their names, they would simply say BBC Burmese to protect them. We're careful with people, of course, not naming them, but that we can tell stories in a very powerful way without me going through all the rigmarole. I mean, if I go into Myanmar illegally, if you go with the insurgents, they know and they know how to look after you, but there is a risk. I stand out. If it's a local journalist or just a local person helping, they don't. They fit in. We risk actually putting people in trouble for having the vanity to insist that we have to be there. So I think there is a rethinking now about how you tell stories from inaccessible places, and it doesn't always involve getting your big-name journalists and parachuting them in.
That's really interesting. You know, if this video gets out, you know, there's going to be some landscape gardener in London applying for a visa, and he's wondering why he can't get a visa anywhere. You know, Sui, talk about covering China. You can go anywhere, and they may not know that you're a journalist. You can blend in a little bit more. You can speak the language. Talk about China and Southeast Asia. Have you ever snuck in anywhere? Tibet?
Yeah. Yes, I do have that skin advantage in my bureau. I've covered, I've gone to all the Tibetan parts of China, been to Xinjiang. They still know though. In terms of sneaking into other parts of Southeast Asia, the New York Times has a flat rule. We don't break the laws, so we try to get journalist visas in all these countries, which, as Jonathan said, is a real pain. You know, filling out 10 pages each time to go to a certain country. So yeah, I mean, there are certain countries I haven't been to since taking on the job. I've been to Burma before. I haven't been there since the coup, that's a huge loss. I haven't been to Laos yet because of the visa situation. So, I mean, Jonathan was right. There is no replacement for being there. And we talk about the 5 senses of reporting, and there's, if you're not able to smell and see and hear and feel, like there's so much lost in reporting. But, in terms of Myanmar, I echo all of what you've just said. We have an excellent Burmese reporter, and who's been, super brave and really courageous reporting what's been going on there. But, I hope things change.
Please think of your questions, because I'm going to ask one more question, and then I'm going to open it up to you guys, because I want to hear what you want to think about. I will ask a question I always get from students, and I'll start with you, Sui, so keep the microphone. When you're reporting in a closed country, whether you're going there officially with a visa or if you happen to be there without a visa, and you're talking to people, how do you protect your sources? Even if they say, you can quote me, and you're going to write a negative story, the Chinese, the Burmese, the Indonesians might come after that person you've interviewed. Or if you don't quote them, you've got a story filled with anonymous quotes. So how do you balance that?
Yeah, I wrestle with this all the time. I actually, after the interview, most interviews, if I know it's going to be a big story, this is going to be a huge story, I will sit down with them and tell them that I work for an American newspaper called the New York Times. It's going to appear this way, it's going to be framed this way. And I sit down and tell them, thank you so much for sharing your story, but this is how it would look like in print. Because I think a lot of people don't understand what it's like to engage with a journalist. And a lot of people are very nice, and they want to help and they want to talk. And if it's, if I'm going to a very close place like Xinjiang, for example, in recent years, I've not gone there just to get vox pops from people and like, what's your daily life like? Because I just know in talking to me, the kind of repercussions they might face is just far worse than what, I get from a story about life in Xinjiang. So it's, it's this kind of calculus you make every day as a journalist. Yeah.
Oh, Jonathan, take the mic. Jonathan, one question I've always had, because Sui and I have both worked in print. You don't have a story unless you've got the voice of the person or even a picture of the person. How do you do that in closed countries?
And, obviously, we're multimedia now, and I'm now doing almost more print almost than video. Video is obviously the BBC's DNA, and in the vernacular of television or video, particularly for a Western audience, seeing the face is important. It's something interesting that Asians tend to avoid. Direct eye contact, people feel emotions through people's eyes. So ideally, we've always wanted to get people on camera in front, with their faces being shown. We do have a very strict duty of care in the BBC, and that means obviously following people. If people say I don't want to be identified, then we talk through with them how we're going to film them. We get them to see in the viewfinder how they will be shown, that their face is in shadow. We make sure that when it's shot, for example, there isn't any chance these days of somebody putting the video into post-production and lifting the shadows so they can see the face. You've got to watch out for that. Software these days can do a lot. But also, when we've done the interview, we will then have a post-discussion usually with our editorial policy advisors back in London, about what we think the risks are. So that person may say to us, I'm very happy for you to use my face, to show my face, but we will make our own decision. And if we think there's a risk, we will say to them, actually, we're not going to show your face. Just because, frankly, it's reputationally very damaging for us if we interview somebody and then by showing them on the BBC, they get into a whole heap of trouble. I mean, it can happen. And some people, it depends who you're talking to. If you're talking to a very prominent political activist, they're out there sometimes taking very high risks already. They will calculate and say to you, the risk of me appearing on the BBC isn't incrementally that much higher than the risks I'm already taking. So for those people, you can think, yeah, they know the risk they're taking, and it's not going to be any greater. I was just telling them that I did a trip to Myanmar on an official visa a couple of years ago, and the military allowed me in and then allowed us to travel up north to Inle Lake, and we looked at how the civil war was affecting people. He wasn't immediately there, but it was quite close by. And we made a decision then not to show the faces of anybody talking to us. So we met lots of people and filmed them, but when they spoke, we always had them off camera so that you couldn't identify who was speaking. And it was a sort of abundance of caution. We were aware that people were going to jail in Myanmar, and jails are awful places in Myanmar. You don't want anyone to go there even for a short time, even for the sort of slightest criticism or perceived criticism of the junta. So even if these people were saying what seemed like completely innocent things about their lives, we decided there was a risk in anybody appearing, any ordinary person, in appearing and actually being filmed, speaking to the BBC. And that made it quite a tricky thing to edit because you never actually saw anyone talking to us. And I had to paraphrase a lot of the things they said. But that was the decision that we took.
Shreyas, talk to me a little bit about that same topic. And also, I'm thinking you must have to interview dissidents who've come out of North Korea, who have family back there, diplomats who are based there, aid groups, UN types coming out. How do you write without revealing who told you what?
Yeah, that's always a tricky question. And to be honest, with North Korea, I think for one thing, it depends on the type of story. At our outlet, we've always had issues with many of the reports that tend to come out that just rely on a single, anonymous, unverified source. And because quite often those are at the heart of a lot of the misleading and sensationalist stories that come out about North Korea. And I get that there is obviously a certain amount of value in any information you can get from sources in North Korea, and their anonymity has to be respected, but have to be very careful about it. And same with with officials or defectors who are living in the South. That said, there are certainly some stories where it is completely unavoidable. Let's say some diplomat or non-profit worker in Pyongyang has sent us some information about something that's going on there. Maybe they spotted smoke trail from a missile test, or maybe they've managed to get some exclusive observations that no one's going to see from in state media. And there we have to say, okay, we have to protect them. So there you just have to, as best as you can, describe roughly who and what they are, or without giving enough information that can be traced back to them. So keep it just vague enough. And if it is important enough, that is obviously a factor that you have to see whether the story is worth covering. If not, then perhaps, it's not worth lowering your standards. But for defectors and anyone associated with North Korea who's living outside the DPRK, that is a whole other factor, because some of them will certainly want to go on the record, want their name given. For example, the North Korean defectors who became politicians in South Korea, they're going to be very public with everything. But most defectors just want to go on with their daily lives. They don't want to be in the public eye. They definitely don't want attention drawn to themselves. And many of them have families back home who they don't want to risk their safety. So in many of these cases, we will talk to them, try and get their side of the story and explain how we are going to cover things. But it'll also have to be extremely respectful to their needs, anonymized where possible, preferably with a pseudonym, something to at least indicate where they're from, what the background is, rather than just going, oh, it is, we've learned that this is being said, or the classic South Korean and Japanese media version, which is, it is known that, or it has been reported that, which, so we have to, as far as possible, at least give some idea of what the source is, but respect their privacy, their need for anonymity, and if there's any way we can, anything we can do to minimize the damage, minimize the potential for damage that can happen to their family, we have to take it. And if there's something that no matter what we do, there will always be a risk, we'd abandon it.
One question I've always been dying to know. The story about Kim Jong-un killing his uncle with an anti-aircraft gun, was that true, or was that just some apocryphal story coming out of North Korea?
Well, so to be honest, that one's always been an interesting one, but the more interesting related rumor to that was eaten by dogs. So there have been lots of variations on that. We've heard different things from different sources. Some have certainly said there was shooting involved, but I think definitely every single North Korea journalist will give you a different version on how seriously to take these things. One thing we can say is that he was executed. Weirdly, we've seen some conspiracy theories in recent years saying, no, he's still alive and well somewhere, or manipulating something from behind the scenes. But I think that is one thing that we can be reasonably certain about. He was killed. There have been high-level North Korean defectors who have come out in the years since and confirmed the manner of execution, for example, basically killed by shooting squad or something along those lines. But I think with North Korea, there's always going to be a bit of doubt about exactly what is happening, what is being said. And it's so easy to just go into any North Korea story saying, oh yeah, it's North Korea, anything goes. It's possible that, they've turned Kim Il-sung's statue into a nuclear missile or whatever. It's just, you don't know. But these things don't really, fundamentally, that's where we always go back to the same thing, which is, does it make sense in terms of how North Korea operates? And in most cases, the answer is no.
Okay, you've got more than 120, 130 years of accumulated journalism experience waiting for your questions. Is there a microphone, or do you want to just stand up and shout? Oh, microphone. There's a microphone. Put your hand up, somebody. Oh. I may not be able to see you if you're behind a pillar. Better turn it on.
Thank you. Hi, thank you so much for your sharings. It was really inspiring. I'm Chloe. I'm a student from Singapore. My question is that within my studies, one issue I find is dealing with big words like democracy, like trying to define them, because there's so many different versions of democracy, so many different metrics of democracy. So my question to you guys is, in your journalistic work, do you guys often find a need to specify or break down these big words? And if so, what kind of metrics do you guys use? Thank you.
That's a great question. I'm going to give it straight to Jonathan. We were talking a little bit about that.
You're speaking my language. I don't even like using the word democracy. I got very sick of the preachiness of the way that democracy was thrown around, and sort of the heyday of globalization. Every US official will come out saying we're spreading democracy. Obviously, democracies aren't that healthy, and we've seen how varied they are and how problematic they are, right from the US through Europe. So I think you're right. We need to be careful how we use terms. Is it relevant? We all know what democracy is as a political system. It has built in it the chance to vote for different candidates and the chance to change your leaders. And it should have built into it a certain amount of accountability in between elections too. But you're right. I think there's a very good argument for extreme care in all the terminology we use. Journalists write under pressure, and we write a lot. And words become cliched very quickly. They become tired. They become ill-used. I mean, I cannot tell you the number of times I see people using the word refute in the wrong way. It drives me mad. They don't know what it means. A little bit more care and language. And I did say to Keith, I'm not particularly comfortable with the title of this session, because I said, it's not our job to report democratic struggles. It's our job to report everything. I mean, I don't like the fact that Vietnam has blacklisted me, but it's an amazing country. And if I go there, I will try to report everything, including what a rather repressive communist government is trying to do, respectfully, but also critically. The fact that it's not democratic. I got one of the reasons I'm blacklisted in Vietnam was I went to cover the Party Congress in 2016, which we don't almost never do, because Vietnam Party Congresses, they're highly choreographed and they're about as interesting as watching paint dry. But it was a contested party congress where it wasn't clear who the new party secretary general was going to be. So I argued with the BBC, I said, we have to cover it. Needless to say, when I got there, the Vietnamese authorities, although they allowed me to go, the minders kind of shut me down. They wouldn't let me anywhere near where all the action was happening, this great sort of, this conference center with all these people standing in line waiting to applaud the new leaders. So I did a lot of reporting basically along the lines of what do ordinary Vietnamese people think, and the broad line I got from them was it's got nothing to do with us. And my reporting accordingly said basically that people of Vietnam have no say over this. And I got summoned to the Foreign Ministry. I knew it was serious because they had 4 teapots lined up. And when you go to the Foreign Ministry in Vietnam, or any ministry, there's always a teapot. If there's 4 teapots, there's going to be 4 officials. That's a grilling. And they absolutely laid into me. They said, you don't understand our system. And I said, I do. And they said, no, you don't. We're democratic. I said, no, you're not. I know how. But we went through all of that. And I'd studied Vietnamese politics at SOAS, and I knew quite a bit about it. I stopped them. I said, listen, I'm not criticizing your system. It's not my job to do that. Whether you're democratic, whatever it is, all I'm saying is how it is. It's not a negative, and I think that's important as journalists. We had this discussion, and the problem is that built into democracy are some of the absolute essential elements of journalism. Freedom of speech, media freedom, accountability. You don't get those with authoritarian governments. So it's very hard for journalists not to be pro-democracy because it's the very heart of what we do. But in terms of the job we do, we report everything.
Shreyas?
Yeah, I think just want to add to what Johnson said. I think the big question is always who gets to define what a democracy is, and that's at the heart of your question. The North Korea, for example, calls itself the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, and I think most people in this room would agree that perhaps the only word in that that's true is Korea. And, well, when we were talking about the Press Freedom Index earlier, a big part of why so many Asian countries, including the ones that are more democratic by most standards, come so low is because we're looking at them in terms of a particular perception, often influenced by the West, of how democracy operates. Now, that doesn't mean it's right or wrong. It just means there are differences in how different countries perceive liberal democratic values. And I think a lot of it, fundamentally, at the end of the day, as Jonathan said, there are some things that are what we'd consider universal values when it comes to a democratic country. But even within those areas, there are shades of gray about how those are interpreted, and press freedom, for example, being one of them. So the artificial barriers that I was talking about in South Korea, if you ask someone, let's say, in many Southeast Asian countries or South Asian countries, if they had that level of transparency, or they'd take it. But in South Korea and Japan, that comes with its own problems. So it's all relative, it all varies. And some systems just seem to perhaps be a little closer to a more established idea of what democracy is done.
We used to have a joke when I covered Africa that any country that had peoples in its name was ruled by a tiny elite, and any country that had democratic in its name was not. Question? We have microphone up here. Oh, he's got 2 microphones.
Yes. Good day, I'm Marlon from GMA Network. I just would like to ask our panelists, what do you think about the rise of fake news and how does it undermine democracy here in the Southeast Asian and Asian region?
Fake news? Yeah. You want to start there?
Well,
there's no fake news in South Korea.
Yes, so I'm glad that you asked the question because my background was in media analysis, and I think it is one of the things that that affects us all in different ways. Every country is dealing with this problem now, and we're seeing a situation where once upon a time the big problem was how do you get access to information? How do you get how do people get to know what is going on? And the assumption was always, oh, you can battle propaganda with more education, more openness. The internet will fix a lot of things. I think right now we're seeing that that isn't always the case. Yes, there are some things that have improved, but just as information has become easier to access, so has misinformation and disinformation. And terms like fake news, they get thrown around a lot, like I said, thanks to Donald Trump. They've been popularized, but there's no shortage of strongman rulers who want to weaponize that to target their political opponents. So let's say South Korea, for example, there's a very fiercely charged political polarization in the country that has led to people essentially living in their own echo chambers, believing only the conspiracy theories they want to believe, or the politicians they want to believe. And what that leads to is situations like the Yoon essentially, by all accounts, watching a lot of these far-right conspiracy theory YouTubers, buying into a lot of the same beliefs, and filing fake news defamation lawsuits against South Korean media outlets. And again, this is something that's happening everywhere, in just playing out in different ways, different platforms, different methods. But it is the biggest challenge we as journalists face as well. How do we deal with people questioning our own credibility? It is something that will take a long time to change, and we've had a lot of sessions during this conference that touched upon disinformation, misinformation, and people's perception of what is real and what's not. There's no easy answer. There's no universal answer. The most we can do is continue trying to report what we know to the best of our ability, trying to essentially be champions for reasonable reporting, for proper journalism, and hope that over time we can also instill a better sense of media literacy, a better awareness of what is real and what's not.
Anybody else, or should we get another question in?
Just very quickly, because you came to the Philippines, I thought it's a good point. Remember having this discussion during the 22 election with my old friend Maria Ressa, who was very upset about the disinformation of the Marcos campaign. And one point I made to her, I said, first of all, the term fake news, I think, has now been weaponized to the point it's meaningless. Everyone bandies it about. There are governments in this region trying to criminalize it. We live in an age of over-information, and a lot of it is wrong, a lot of it is distorted, a lot of it is disinformation, but that is the environment we live in. I said to Maria, as that's the environment we live in, you have to work within it. And one point I made to her was, Marcos won in 22, a spectacular amount, the first sort of outright majority, through an unbelievably distorted version of his family's history. But the point about that election was he told a better story than his opponent. Lenny Robredo, the opponent, was truer to all the principles of integrity and good values that we all think of as essential to a democracy. But Marcos's was the story that Filipinos liked better. Whether it was true or not didn't matter to them. And that's the world we live in now. That's the problem. We've got to tell good stories. As journalists, we have to tell true stories, and we must stay true to our calling. But unless the stories are compelling, we will lose to the sometimes very seductive narratives of those weaving fictions.
Great summary. Another question? We got time for about one or two more. I can't see any hands up. Come on, way over here. Okay, one and then two in the middle there.
Okay, I have two questions. I'm Pasit from Reuters. The first question is about China. Yeah, I would like to ask from your experience, because I have some Chinese friends who told me okay, in China, it has a very obvious red line, something that you can report, the corruption of local government, local authorities, or something like that. But yeah, if you cross that line, you will be in trouble. So, what do you think in terms of your experience? What do you think about this? Is it true, or you think differently, or something like that? And another question is about making your interviewee to be anonymous. Yeah, have you ever experienced some stories that were very sensitive, and you have to, not disclose the name or the identity of all interviewees. Yeah, but as you can imagine, like the more anonymous sources, the less like people, the maybe not like less credibility. Yeah, if people look into your stories, like how you handle that. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Sui, you can take that because you've danced up to the red line more than once and probably have been invited to tea.
Well, we actually the New York Times breached the red line by reporting on the wealth of Wen Jiabao, and which caused actually my colleague Ching Ching's in the room. She's the editor of the Chinese website, and that caused a lot of pain for us. After that, actually, it wasn't actually until that point where they would tell you explicitly what the red line was. And after that, they would tell you the red line is the wealth of our leaders. And it was reporting on Xi Jinping specifically and his family. That was also another red line. And the other question about anonymous sources, at the Times we have a very high bar for what, who we grant anonymity to. We obviously use that very carefully because we don't want, we don't want people to lose to lose faith in us. I can only think of one story recently where the entire story was anonymous, was a story that we did from Myanmar, actually. It was a story about doctors and nurses turning to prostitution. And that was one of the rare instances where the entire story was anonymous, but because we gave enough details in the story that made it seem like these were not, people we were just, these were real people we were interviewing, that passed our bar.
Okay. Anybody else, or should I get the last question in? Last question in the middle there, you have the microphone.
Hello. Thank you so much for this very stimulating discussion. My name is Sui-Lee. I come from one of those closed countries, China. And it is really important that there are people on the ground, like international players, reporting on these red line issues where us as Chinese citizens cannot touch. But I also noticed from my experience covering stories in China functioning within the red line that the restrictions actually has created a lot of creativity, forcing Chinese journalists and homegrown outlets to dance around the issues in a meaningful way. And but sometimes I feel like there is a divide between how issues reporting in these settings are talked about on the international level versus what's happening on the ground in terms of these smaller players of media. So I have noticed more like journalist supports organizations or award structures that are trying to recognize the work being done on the ground. But I wonder what are some other ways to bridge that divide to kind of put these different levels of information structures and different levels of effort together, maybe coming from your perspective working for BBC and New York Times. How is this, is there any room or future for having a more integrated way of telling stories from the ground?
That's a great closing question for our panel. I'm just going to add in, I'll chime in with just one quick note. When I covered Indonesia, for one example, I found that the Indonesian journalists would sort of write things in a coded way. I could read it and see what they were trying to say, and then I could write it more directly in the Washington Post. Or I could go interview an Indonesian journalist. They would tell me everything going on. I could then write it in the Washington Post. Then they could repeat everything by saying, the Washington Post reported that. So you're asking, really, is there some way to make those collaborations a little bit more official as opposed to us just doing it that way? So why don't you talk first, Sui-Lee?
I mean, Chinese journalists were actually some of my best sources when I was in China. Like you said, obviously the red lines are much clearer for people like you because you're a Chinese citizen. So I would meet Chinese journalists at press briefings and they're like, we can't report on this, but maybe you can, we've got a tip. And I feel like actually it was much more collegial that way in China, that they understood that because we had this tip and we, obviously there's a lot of danger, they won't get past the censors. So like, let's pass it on to somebody who we think can carry this forward. I don't see that much in Southeast Asia, but I'm available for tips. But yeah, I mean, I think it's because the Chinese media have been amazing in covering a lot of stories that I think a lot of foreign media miss.
Jonathan?
I'll be very quick because I know our time is technically up. The first thing to say is that obviously there's a very different perspective for local journalists and international journalists. Our job is to take quite complex issues or detailed stuff that's going on in a country. Our audiences, particularly Southeast Asia, doesn't resonate much with them. You've got Gaza and Ukraine in the news all the time. Southeast Asia is, news-wise, is quite a quiet place. So every time we have to tell a story, we've got to sort of really make it meaningful to an audience that don't know much. Of course, the BBC has language services, so I work alongside my Burmese, my Thai, and my Vietnamese colleagues, writing stories they're writing for a local audience. They're finding stories that they need to do for their audience that their audience isn't getting. I've got to find the angles that work for an international audience. I will echo what Sui-Lee said. Local journalists are a phenomenal resource for us and incredibly valuable. And they do most of the legwork. They're just day in, day out covering it. We're dipping into this country and that country. So we rely very heavily on them. The cooperation is fantastic. But my Vietnamese colleagues love it if we work together. We work together on a lot of stories because they love seeing what they wrote in Vietnamese for a Vietnamese audience translated into something that will get a global audience and seeing how the perspectives change. More cooperation like that, always valuable.
Last word? Shreyas?
Yeah, I think I'll keep it as brief as possible. So, yeah, I think pretty much my entire journalism career has been built around trying to understand what local media in the different countries are saying. And I think that is, as Jonathan said, it brings an invaluable perspective. You actually get to see what really matters, but at the same time, you get to understand things from their perspective. But at the same time, just echoing what Jonathan said, we cater to different audiences. We follow a different style. And so for us, it's about just taking a look at everything that's going on at that local level and then trying to see what is there here that really makes sense and matters to our global audiences. And so it's about trying to understand and learn from the locals who are living those stories every day, and then trying to just reinterpret it in a way that makes sense for the rest of the world without losing the essence of what was originally there.
I'd like you all to give it up for this amazing panel right here. Shreyas, Jonathan Head, Sui.
Wow, what a fantastic panel to close on. Thank you so much, Keith, Sui-Lee, Jonathan, and Shreyas. I mean, it's not easy to distill 135 years of journalistic excellence in an hour and a half, but hey, you guys did it. Thank you.